You're hearing that the people who were retiring there, and then they woke up to find that I think some group of Mexican Indians claimed ownership of the land, and the Mexican government decided that, yeah. Well, pardon me? Okay, so there was a major upheaval in that part of their territory concerning who owned the land. And now, if you're going to invest in a country, you want to be very sure who owns the land. That has to be something which is beyond doubt. And so if you have a country that doesn't have secure title of land, well, that by itself, I think, badly sabotages investment. So if everything has to be located on land, and the structures are not separable from the land, really. So if that comes into doubt, you don't want to invest there. So I say that, in addition to other things, would make the Mexican money less valuable. And throughout the world, there isn't all that much security of property. See, the United States is pretty distinct. The United States and other countries that have a heritage of Anglo-Saxon law, these are the countries with the greatest security of property. And that makes them the best places in which to invest. And this is a leading reason why people around the world are comfortable investing in the United States more perhaps than anywhere else. Because here, at least up to now, property rights have been fairly secure. You haven't had to worry about arbitrary convulsions giving major chunks of land back to different groups. Yes, Mr. Moraski.
Yeah, I'm just going back to the production of money. The money was first developed. In this case, every ounce of gold that the government had, they printed $1 or however, which wasn't a $35 per ounce of gold for years and years until 1955. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, till 1968. We're going to go into that in some detail. If not tonight, certainly next week, but I hope tonight.
But now, when they first originally did that, that probably determined what they were going to, how much money they were going to produce. Is that correct?
Well, you see, under a gold standard, what determines the quantity of money is the amount of gold. What determines the rate of increase in the quantity of money is the state of gold money. With a gold standard, the money supply increases only to the extent that new and additional gold is dug out of the earth and exceeds the quantity demanded for jewelry and other industrial purposes. And this is a very major factor, as I hope we'll get to see very, very soon. So,
another part of the question.
Yeah.
How does the government determine how much money it's going to print in a year? Is that based on the economy? I mean, how much money our country is actually making?
What determines the rate at which the quantity of money is increased when it has no connection to gold?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very, very good question. And the answer is there is no fixed principle of any kind. One prominent economist who's now over 90 years old, Milton Friedman, he urged for many, many years that the government adopt some kind of monetary rule. And that would be increase the quantity of money by some defined percentage year in and year out, not more, not less, come hell or high water. He had some changes in the percentage as high as 5%, as low as 2%. At different times he advocated different figures. But no government has adopted that, and you can be sure if they did adopt it, they wouldn't hold it. Just like we had legislation on the books that the budget deficit was supposed to be eliminated. That lasted how long? About a year or so. There's nothing to bind the government to that. So what's determining the rate of increase in the quantity of money is considerations of political expediency. Like here we are, there's concern, we're threatened with a recession, and so the Federal Reserve goes full blast to lean against that, reduces short-term interest rates all the way down to 1%, and is attempting to manufacture enough additional money to keep rates down at that low level. And other people are claiming, well, that's not enough. They should be doing even more. Have more tax cuts while the government continues to spend the same, and then the deficit can be financed to a considerable degree by the manufacture of additional money by the Federal Reserve. Now, how much is enough? How much is too much? These are subjects of argument. And then there can be unexpected demands on the government's budget. There's the war on terror. That takes a lot of money. The war in Iraq takes money. Who knows what other things can come up. And then there'll be needs for additional billions. Now we have the prescription drug benefit that's just being phased in. That will require many billions. And the politicians don't want to raise taxes to cover these expenditures. So what is a likely source of the funds? Create more money. And creating more money is seen as the solution for almost every problem. So the one thing you can say with confidence is that the value of any of these irredeemable paper monies is certainly going to decline over the years. The only question is how rapidly. And I know this is a very personal concern to me, because I'm close to the age of retiring, and I know that if I put my money into fixed income securities, which can guarantee me a certain annual monetary income, I know that with each passing year the buying power of the dollar is going to be less, and I will not have more income, so I'll have permanently declining income. And who knows where prices will be 25 years from now, at which point I'm still hoping to be alive. And I know that in the last 25 years, prices have certainly increased pretty dramatically. And should I count on them increasing only to the same extent, or might they increase twice as fast or 5 times as fast? Nobody can know. So there's tremendous uncertainty concerning anything denominated in a fixed number of dollars, and dollars are perhaps the best paper money of any. And this applies to contracts of any kind. Suppose you own a building or a piece of land, and you enter into a long-term lease contract. And so you'd agree that every year so many thousands of dollars or whatever will be paid to you. Well, if this is a long-term lease, who knows what that money is going to be worth later on in the lease. So it's really a kind of financial quicksand. Yes, Mr. Taylor.
This is the following. So I understand how we try to stir the economy, lower interest rates, and therefore create more spending, create more spending. But on the fundamental part around increasing money that I still don't get, maybe again with questions is actually what happens if there's no policy around how much money to spend. How does that actually work? There's someone they're down in ring fans simply say we're going to print X number of dollars this year. Is that actually how it happens when they print that? And is there a monitoring process that says this is how much money we destroy each year? Because it seems that at the end of the day, if I get this right, the amount of money that's out there, the more money that's out there is deflates the value. So what's the management process?
How do they determine how much to increase the quantity of money?
Yeah, what's the actual process? I heard you say there is no rule.
Yeah.
So one, how do they determine? Okay, we're about to print, 1 billion more, and then what actually happens? And then how do they manage it on that?
Well, yeah.
They plan for your money, like you say. They know, do you know how much money has been printed this year? Every year they come out with the new quarters and the pennies and new dollars now.
Yeah. There are somewhat reasonable statistics on the money supply, and in fact, put them on the website. I got these figures right before the term started. There's a 2-week lag. The money supply measured one way, according to M1, which is currency outside the banking system, currency in circulation outside the banking system, plus checking deposits, conventional type checking deposits. That, as of the week ended August 16th, was $1,337,000,000,000. Now that is probably that's too small a measure of the money supply. At one time, it would have been an adequate measure, but since around 1994 or 95, there's been some significant changes in the makeup of the money supply, and so the conventional M1 measure of currency out in circulation and conventional checking deposits, that's really inadequate. And there's one or more additional components that need to be added. And so here we have M1 traditional, year by year. We'll get to the most recent, 1337. Then there's another column here, cumulative sweeps. And there's a little article attached to this that explains just what sweeps are. They came into existence in 1994, and today they're estimated as representing practically 620 billion more. So if we add that to the 1337, the money supply would be practically 1957. And what these sweeps are is banks, which there are checking deposits, starting in 1994, began to make arrangements with large depositors so that on weekends and holidays they could shift money from the checking accounts of these large depositors into something that would be classified as a savings account of one form or another. So during regular business days, the money you have is in a checking account among many of these large depositors. But on weekends, when the money isn't accessible anyway, and on holidays when it's not accessible, the banks say they put it in something classified as a savings account. Now, why should they want to do that? Well, the banks are required by the Federal Reserve to hold reserves against conventional checking deposits. Typically, the reserve requirement is on the order of 10%. You can make as a rough principle that whatever conventional checking deposits are held with a bank, that bank needs to have a reserve equal to 10% of the checking deposits. And where do they have the reserve? Well, they can have it in part or even in whole in the form of their own checking deposit with the Federal Reserve Bank of their region. So imagine, for the sake of illustration, Bank of America has $10 billion in deposits, checking deposits. Well, Bank of America would be required, roughly, to have a reserve of $1 billion, roughly 10%. And where would this be? Well, it would be in the form largely of checking deposits held by Bank of America with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco as the regional Federal Reserve Bank. And for the rest, Bank of America's reserve would be in the form of vault cash, currency within its own system, literally money in their own vaults. The two components, vault cash and deposit with the Federal Reserve, combined have to add up to the required reserve, which we're assuming as 10%. Now, Bank of America can't lend its required reserves, and that means they can't earn any interest on the required reserves. So that's a dead asset for them. They would much prefer to lend out some of those required reserves. And starting in 1994, the Federal Reserve allowed them to start to do so, because in transferring money from checking deposits to something classified over the weekends as a savings deposit, that served to reduce the required reserves. See, if something is not counted as a checking deposit, well, then you don't have to have 10% against it. There's no reserve requirement against savings deposits, or a much, much lesser one. So this meant that the banks could reduce their required reserves. They could have the same volume of deposits, but have less required reserves, which permitted them to expand their loans and earn interest on a greater volume of outstanding loans. And then, of course, as they made these additional loans, this entailed the creation of new and additional deposits. So what happened was the volume of deposits ended up being larger. The same volume of reserves ended up supporting a larger volume of deposits. And these sweeps represent how much more the conventional money supply would have increased had these sweeps been counted that way. Yes.
What's the benefit to the depository of taking savings, a different amount of money for a 2-day period? What benefit is gained by them for getting interest on that? And how do they know now if they know it's only available for 2 days? Not too many people going to keep a loan for a day.
No, the loan would not be for 2 days, but you see, they have required reserves based on an average. I think it's the average of a week period or a 2-week period. So if they can reduce their required reserves 2 days out of the week, that's reducing the required reserves 28%. And then they have this much money available on a longer-term basis, so they can make loans of a longer-term nature.
Professor, my apologies. I didn't answer that last question, which one component was when and how do we actually, the Federal Reserve actually make the decision to print more money?
When do they make the decision to print more money? Okay. At present, I don't think they're deciding, even viewing it as a decision over how much money to print. In recent years, there's gotten to be some confusion over just what is the money supply. There's this issue of the sweeps. Then there are further factors, retail money market accounts. So there are some people who say the Federal Reserve can't even know for sure what the money supply is at the moment, and there are different ways of computing it. And so what they have been going by is an interest rate policy. And when they reduce the federal funds rate, which is the one that you hear about when the Federal Reserve raises rates or lowers rates, in the last few meetings, I think they had 2 raises, I think. It was down to 1% earlier this year. Then they had 2 meetings since the beginning of the year at which they've had quarter-point increases in the federal funds rate. And in previous few years, the federal funds rate was reduced several full percentage points over since the year 2000, I believe. Now, the federal funds rate is the rate that banks pay in borrowing reserves from one another. See, the different banks have required reserves, and the banks are monitoring their reserve position. They know from day to day pretty much what their deposits are. They can calculate what their reserve requirements are, and they know that the reserves that they have are greater than what they're required to have or less than what they're required to have. And banks facing a reserve deficiency are interested in borrowing additional reserves. They don't want to go to the Federal Reserve itself unless they have to. They'd rather obtain needed reserves from other banks. And banks that have excess reserves, they're willing to lend the reserves. And there's a market, an interbank market in these funds that qualify as reserves, and this is called the federal funds market, and the rate of interest on these interbank funds, the federal funds, is called the federal funds rate. And this is published, I think in some places daily, expect the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times to have it daily. Here, key rates. This appears every day in the business section of the New York Times. So as yesterday, the day before, and a year ago at the same time. And it's got the federal funds rate. A year ago, it was 1.04. Yesterday, sometime at the end of August, it was 1.5%. That reflects two increases. Now, the Federal Reserve announces a target for the federal funds rate. Now, how do they achieve this target? Well, they're watching what is the rate on federal funds in the federal funds market, and if it's getting above their target, I think it was 1.04 a year ago, they had a target of 1. Well, how would they nudge it down from 1.04 to 1? Or how would they nudge it down from 1.55 to 1.5? I'm assuming you guys in the back can see this. Am I wrong? Okay. Well, the Federal Reserve is in a position at any given time to increase or decrease the supply of federal funds. They can increase the funds that qualify as reserves, or decrease them. And how do they do this? Well, the leading way is by means of what is called the open market operation. The open market operation. The Federal Reserve, above all the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, on any given day can be buying or selling securities in the open market. Almost always they confine themselves to government securities. So they could be buying United States Treasury bills or other Treasury securities, 10-year notes or whatever, or sometimes they might sell them. Now, when the Federal Reserve buys government securities, what is it paying for them with?
Market value.
Pardon me?
Market value.
Well, the market value, but where does it get the money? Suppose the Federal Reserve Bank of New York will place an order to buy $1 billion worth of United States Treasury, short-term Treasury securities. T-bills. Pardon me? Somebody said print it? That's essentially what they do. They print the money. Now, it's not literally a process of running the paper through presses, and this relates to the paperless issue. The Federal Reserve can create money by a computer entry. They can create a credit to a checking account. They manufacture a cashier's check. Let's look at the process. Suppose the Federal Reserve places an order for $1 billion worth of Treasury securities, and it's from some bond dealer or securities dealer, and that dealer has had to obtain the securities from private individuals, private firms, and now the Federal Reserve Bank of New York perhaps will issue a cashier's check, or maybe the dealer has an account with the Federal Reserve. I don't know the precise mechanism, but let's assume he doesn't have his own account with the Federal Reserve. I think that's limited to government institutions and foreign governments. So let's say the Federal Reserve Bank of New York issues a cashier's check to Solomon Brothers or whatever, assuming they're one of the dealers. Well, what will Solomon Brothers do? And it, of course, will turn over the Treasury securities to the Federal Reserve. They then become one of the Fed's assets. What will Solomon Brothers do with his check, cashier's check, issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York? They will deposit it in their checking account, maybe their banker. I don't know who their banker is, but let's assume it's Citibank in New York. That would be a likely candidate. So now Citibank has the $1 billion cashier's check from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It will credit the account of Solomon Brothers, so their checking account is plus $1 billion. And Citibank has this cashier's check. They'll present it to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Their checking account with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York will now be plus $1 billion. So there's an additional $1 billion of reserves possessed by Citibank. Now, what does this do to Citibank's reserve position? It increased it. If they had a deficiency before, they almost certainly don't now. And so Citibank will have excess reserves. How will this affect the federal funds rate? It should lower it. Now imagine the Federal Reserve buying government securities. There'll be cashier's checks going to a variety of banks around the country, perhaps just major banks. But their excess reserves will be increased. They'll have more money available to offer in the federal funds market. And so how will that affect the federal funds interest rate? It'll go down. And so the Federal Reserve sees, okay, now we've brought the federal funds rate down to where we want it. And the process of doing so rests on the creation of new and additional money that qualifies as reserves. And now that the banks have these additional reserves, they'll have more excess reserves. What does that enable the banks to do in the way of their own lending operations? They can lend more, and in the process, that will entail deposit creation, which represents an expansion in the quantity of money. Yes, Mr. Rosenthal, yes. Yeah, the essence of it is, I think, in chapter 12. Yeah. Pardon?
The reading that you have in the website, you showed us accumulation.
Yeah. No, but in the text, in chapter 12.
Now, when it comes to explanation of this, I'm saying I have a good explanation in the reading too.
In which in the supplementary ones? Where is that? Oh, yes. You're talking about the Dow Jones book. The sweeps program, I don't think that goes into the federal funds rate, does it?
No.
No. Okay. Yes.
Talk a lot about the value of gold, precious metals, monetary systems.
Yeah.
Is that feasible today? Is there enough gold to do that?
Is there enough gold to have a precious metal system? Well, that depends on what the value of a unit of gold would be.
Well, $460 an ounce, whatever you want to call it.
$400 an ounce, or anything close to $400 an ounce, I don't think would be sufficient. You'd have to have a value of gold probably on the order of $2,000 to $3,000 an ounce, if not more. But you see, if you had it, whatever the physical supply of gold is, it could be made equal to whatever the supply of dollars is. There is always some number that will equate the number of gold ounces with the number of dollars outstanding. If you took we have to do this on a global basis if you want to think of it that way. If the world money supply were $5 trillion, well then, and if the supply of monetary gold in the world, if that were 4 billion ounces, well then I believe 4 billion ounces would equate to $5 trillion at $1,250 an ounce.
Is that a realistic option here? Do you think that is?
It's a realistic option. I don't think that this could be achieved overnight dramatically, but there are, I think, if not opposed, the market would spontaneously move toward gold. In the same way that people in Argentina and Panama would like to move toward dollars, I think similar considerations would move private citizens in the United States and the other advanced countries toward gold. And let me spend a little time on that. Believe it or not, I do have material on that in the syllabus, or in the syllabus supplement. Let me see if I can bring it up quickly. Pardon me?
Are you going to talk about the gold and
Yeah. Now, how is that? Well, you see, I would get to this under the heading of the problem of inflation, how our whole problem of inflation understood as or the aspect of constantly rising prices. Why are prices continually rising? There's more and more money being created, and just think, how quickly are you able to create irredeemable fiat money, irredeemable paper money, or the paperless paper money, the checkbook money, the electronic money? What are these physical difficulties in the way of increasing the quantity of that money? We have a shortage of paper or ink. And if we did, you could still add a zero to whatever paper you have. Or electronically, you can create billions of dollars with a few keystrokes. So an essential characteristic of irredeemable fiat money is that there is no physical limit to its quantity, and it is virtually costless to produce. You have a money that has virtually no cost of production and no physical limitations to its quantity. Now, why then does it have any value at all? So you just think, in other cases, we have goods with a very minimal cost of production. What's the cost of production of paper clips, rubber bands, pins, table salt? What's the cost of production of these things? It's minimal, right? And what's the effect of that on their value, given that the production of these things can easily be increased? It's not that someone has a monopoly on the production of table salt. Anytime you have something with a minimal cost, whose production can be expanded without any problem, what will be the effect on the value of such a thing? It has a very minimal value. Now, if you ask, why should the value of paper dollars be any greater than the value of the paper clips? And how much more does it cost to produce this than a paper clip? Now, what do you think would happen if this sort of thing were produced under the freedom of competition? So here we are, we have something that has the buying power of a dollar, but if you can get the same color ink and have the same, they're trying it. Now, imagine, suppose there were no laws against counterfeiting. What do you think? It would become worthless. In fact, it would have less value than paper clips and pins. You see, today, you go into a supermarket and have a wallet full of this currency, you come out with a shopping cart full of groceries. But if the day ever came when you had to go into the market with a shopping cart full of the paper money and come out with a wallet full of groceries, then the money would be dumped in the sewers. People wouldn't want it. But that's where its value would go under free competition. Now, why doesn't the value go there? Well, why doesn't the value go to nil today? But when we limit the supply, there are counterfeiting laws. The only party legally allowed to increase the quantity of money is the government. So that prevents the immediate destruction of the value of the money. It doesn't evaporate overnight. Because only the government is allowed to create it. It has a monopoly privilege on the creation of new and additional money. But even so, while the money doesn't collapse overnight, the government has enormous and irresistible temptations. Because here's the government, what is their cost of expanding the quantity of money? Virtually none. What are the demands made upon the government for additional money? Aren't there all kinds of groups with their hands out, give me money for this, this is an urgent need, how can you ignore these vital needs? And people are enumerating the needs and what would be the benefits of a program, and they don't feel any requirement of considering costs. Well, the government wants to be reelected, whoever is in power wants to be reelected, and what is always a method of gaining some significant constituency? Give them money. Now, on the other side, it's not very popular to raise taxes. So if the government is under pressure always to increase its spending, but doesn't want to raise taxes, and they have the power to create money, well, how much further do we need to look? The government has a constant temptation to expand the quantity of money because it represents a kind of wish and illusion fulfillment. People think that they think of the government as the source of free benefits. Now, what allows them to think that? See, suppose the government could not create money. Imagine the government didn't have that power. And they wouldn't if the money were gold. See, gold is something the government hasn't figured out how to create. Alchemists have been at it, but they have never been able to succeed. So if the money were gold, the government could not create money. And what would that imply about any additional spending the government wanted to do? They couldn't do it. The only way to have the money would be from taxes or cutting other government expenditures, neither of which they want to do. Well, now, if the government couldn't create money, and people are clamoring for some new government program, and the only way the government can get the money for the program is by raising their taxes or cutting some other program, how likely of success would proposals for new government programs be? They would be very unlikely. At any time anyone proposed some new government program, immediately the question would be raised, where do you get the money? In effect, show me the money, or show me where you're getting the money. And the government would have to say, well, we're getting it from you. That wouldn't be very popular. Now, when the government has the ability to create money, there's an incredible disconnect. With the ability to create money, the government is really in a position to say, okay, we have our own source of money. We have money that we don't have to get from the citizens. Where can we get it? Well, we can manufacture the money. The government then has a source of funds that is independent of the citizenry. And this creates a tremendous reversal of the way people think of the relationship between the citizen and the government. See, if the government couldn't create money, where would it have to get all of its money? From the citizens. For a little while, they might borrow the money, but they couldn't do that for very long, because then their debt would be growing, the interest rates they pay would be rising, they'd end up in bankruptcy. Unless they're utterly reckless, they'd want to avoid that. If they want to avoid incurring debt, which they know is a destructive dead end, then they must have a balanced budget. They must always secure the funds to meet their expenditures in the current year to avoid the accumulation of debt. But that means all new spending is additional taxes, which makes the spending very unpopular. The citizens would know that they are the source of the government's money. They would not believe that the government can collectively give them anything. They would know that whatever the government is giving any one citizen, it is taking from another citizen. And so the people would see the government as financially dependent on them. Well, when the government doesn't have that constraint, when the government can manufacture its own money, then the people think they are dependent on the government. And the government, in effect, today stands outside the economic system. It has its own money. People think, well, here we are, we're in a recession, times are getting tough. The government can spend billions or trillions, if necessary, from where? Well, it will manufacture money to whatever extent necessary. You see, people are looking to the government as supporting them, when in reality, ultimately, it's the people who have to support the government. But this permits a tremendous expansion in what the government does. You have a radically smaller government if people recognized that every dollar of additional government spending would be a dollar of additional taxes. Yes, Mr. Son.
Traditionally, it's that the U.S. dollar is backed up by gold for many, many years. And ever since, this is true, ever since the turn of the technological era in the early 1990s, U.S. dollar that no longer backed by gold, is backed by intellectual property. Now, if that's the case,
intellectual property?
Yeah, that's what I heard. And so, if that's the case, how could U.S. government got other countries bought into the concept of that U.S. dollar essentially is not, no longer backed up by gold, because gold essentially is worthless. From $500-something an ounce down to $200 back in the early 1990s, and then the technology stopped, evolutionized the entire economic system, if you will.
Well, you're saying historically the dollar was backed by gold, and you think that this ended when
in the 1990s.
It ended a lot before that. There's one of the things I have planned here. Notice I'm devoting the period to answering your questions, but in the process of doing so, I am covering material on this supplement. Notice I have a point here 4 under the heading The Origin and Evolution of Money and the Contemporary Monetary System. How did we get to the state of the money that we have today, when in the past, at one point, it was essentially gold money? Well, from the founding of the United States, dating from the Constitution, I should say, which I believe was enacted in 1788, in the Constitution, there is a statement of Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. And from the enactment of the Constitution down to the Civil War, the Constitution was understood to prohibit the federal government from issuing anything but gold and silver coin as money. There was nothing in the Constitution that said the government shall have the power to print money. It said to coin money. That was understood to be precious metal money. And so the only money issued by the federal government from 1788 to 1861 or 2 was gold or silver coin. And that money was literally bars of gold shaped as coins and stamps. Now, in this period, there also was privately issued paper money in the form of bank notes, currency, folding currency, and checking deposits. And this amounted to a significant part of the total money supply, but these privately issued bank notes and checking deposits were all redeemable on demand in gold or silver. And so the banks were obligated to pay gold or silver, and the country was on a tight gold standard, and the value of the dollar was defined as approximately 1/20th of an ounce of gold of a definite fineness. Now, periodically, the paper portion, the claims to gold, the banknotes, and the checking deposits, again and again, they came to be overissued. They came to be issued in a quantity too great for the available quantity of gold behind them. And while the process of expansion was underway, there would be conditions of a boom, there'd be new and additional money, but again and again it culminated in bankruptcies and the failure of banks. And when a bank would fail, the quantity of money would actually decline, would go into a negative territory. Just imagine that you have a checking deposit at some bank, and you woke up one morning and you learned that your bank had failed, and no other bank took it over, and there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Well, what do you think that would do to the quantity of money? to reduce it. You had a checking deposit. Now, the checking deposit was accepted as the equivalent of standard money, but now it has the status of a junk bond, and you can't use it to spend. Well, again and again, that happens. Now, so long as the banknotes, the currency, was privately issued by a multitude of separate banks, each one had its own currency with these different size, color, appearance. We've seen stock certificates of different companies. No two of them are very similar. Well, there was as much variation in the paper currencies of the different private banks. And there was tremendous risk with these different private banks. So unless you were pretty much of an expert, you would not want to accept the notes of a bank unless you could hightail it pretty quickly to the main office and cash it for gold or silver. So the ability of banknotes to circulate much beyond the offices that issued them was very limited. So what did people have to use as money to be sure of having a kind of money that would be accepted everywhere? Precious metals. Okay, so precious metal money played a major role in the daily life of the people down to the Civil War. Now, in the Civil War, both sides issued irredeemable paper money. The Southern money became utterly worthless. The Northern money, they issued greenbacks. The greenbacks were dollars, but you couldn't redeem them for gold. Later, you could, starting in 1879. But from the time their issue began, which I believe was in 1861, or in the early years of the Civil War, they were irredeemable. Now, this was not the most significant factor. What was more significant was that in the Civil War, in 1863, a bill was passed known as the National Bank Act, which began the national banking system. And you may notice that a bank will say, like we have in Chicago, there's First National Bank of Chicago. I think there's the First National Bank of Boston and Philadelphia. Other banks are national banks without that being prominent in their names. I think Chase Manhattan, Citibank, these are members of the national bank system. So this goes back to 1863. And what the National Bank Act did was it prohibited the issue of private banknotes. It imposed, it said you could do it, but you had to pay a tax of 10% of the value of the banknotes. It took away all profit from the issue of these private banknotes. Instead, the members of the national bank system were empowered to issue national bank notes. These national bank notes all had a uniform size, color, and appearance. Only in the fine print would you see any distinction. In the fine print, it might say a national bank note issued by First National Bank of Boston rather than Chicago or wherever. But for all intents and purposes, we now had, for the very first time, a uniform national paper currency, these national banknotes. And there were fairly stringent requirements connected with their issuance. The banks that issued them had to have a gold reserve equal to 25% of the face value of the notes. So as the Bank of Podunk issued $1 million of national bank notes, it needed to have $250,000 in actual gold as part of its reserve. And on top of that, they needed to have United States government securities equal to a further 90% of the value of the notes. And these government securities, certainly starting after the Civil War, were all redeemable in gold. Let me say that the experience of the Civil War with the greenbacks and the inflation that entailed brought about a couple of generations where practically every contract needed to have a gold clause. People were burned very badly in the Civil War with depreciated paper dollars, and thereafter, down to 1933, they insisted on a gold clause, making debts payable in gold. So the federal debt was payable in gold, principal and interest, practically all the corporate debt, the railroad bonds, mortgages for the most part, practically everything was payable on a gold basis. But the National Bank Act, with this tremendous gold cover for the national banknotes and their uniform size and appearance, this made it possible for the first time to have a national paper currency. And these notes came quickly to be accepted without question everywhere throughout the country. Well, what do you think this did to people's perceived need to have holdings of gold coins? It went down, and so if you look at the statistics, decade by decade, following the Civil War, there was a significant decline in the circulation of actual gold coin. And by the time of World War I, or even sooner, gold coin had practically ceased to circulate. It was legal. You could redeem paper money on demand for gold, and the banks had to give it to you. But outside of a few areas, maybe in Nevada or Montana, where they were still mining precious metals, gold coin did not circulate. Children might get a gold coin on their birthday or something, but it ceased to be mined. And so by the time of World War I, there had been a generation or more of people who had virtually no experience of the active use of gold. And then in 1913, the Federal Reserve System was established. And in 1917, I believe, there was a World War I amendment to the original Federal Reserve Act. And this required that the private banks, which had meanwhile gathered up practically the entire gold supply of the country, see, people who didn't feel the need to hold gold coin any longer, where did they put it? They put it in the bank. The smaller banks redeposited it with the bigger banks. And by 1917, practically the whole gold supply of the country was held by a small number of very large banks in New York City and to some extent in Chicago. And then this World War I amendment to the Federal Reserve Act required that these banks turn over their gold holdings to the Federal Reserve System. And in exchange, they got Federal Reserve notes and checking deposits with the Federal Reserve banks. So something to keep in mind, the real major government control over the gold supply came about well before the New Deal. The New Deal came into office in 1933. But the major transfer of gold occurred as early as 1917 under this wartime amendment to the Federal Reserve Act. Now, in 1933, we had this, we were in the depths of the worst depression in our history. This was the depression characterized by wave after wave of bank failures. And as the bank failures occurred, the quantity of money was reduced, which undercut the volume of spending, made it more difficult to repay debts, caused still more bankruptcies and bank failures. So this is why the process was one of wave after wave. It was like a house of cards, tremendous issuance of claims to gold for which there was no gold, and one bank after another was going belly up. Now when the New Deal took power, it wanted to end this process, and there was a banking holiday for several days. The banks were just closed. I guess something to compare to the closure of the stock market after 9/11. And when they reopened, they no longer had any obligation to pay gold, and in fact, an early New Deal measure was to compel the private citizens to hand in the remaining gold coin to the federal government at the rate of 20 paper dollars per ounce of gold. And so from that point on, there was virtually no lawful monetary gold in private hands. There was a couple of years of indeterminacy, but in 1935, the official exchange value of gold was raised from approximately $20 an ounce, where it had been since 1788, to $35 an ounce. But American citizens did not have any right to redeem their paper dollars for gold. The redemption at $35 an ounce was allowed only to foreign governments and foreign central banks, not to private citizens. In fact, there were severe legal penalties imposed on the private ownership of gold for monetary purposes, comparable or maybe even worse than those on the possession of some drugs today. If you were caught owning gold for monetary purposes, there could be a fine as high as $10,000 and a year in jail. And there was a 20% excise tax imposed on the use of gold in jewelry. Now, only gradually were these very draconic laws repealed, and it wasn't until 1975 that the free private ownership of gold was again fully recognized. But now, following 1935, the federal government attempted to maintain an international price of gold of $35 an ounce, and they were able to maintain that until as late as around 1968. Now, what happened was, in the late 30s, and then in World War II, we got most of the monetary gold that had previously been held in Western Europe. The European countries were buying military supplies, and to the extent they were buying from the United States, and they were inflating their own money more than we were inflating the dollar. They were running a negative balance of payments. The United States was collecting in more money than it owed, and we were getting the net balance largely in gold. So we had a huge gold stock by the end of World War II, much greater than we do today. Now, a treaty in World War II was known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, whereby the United States would still have a currency tied significantly to gold. The dollar was defined at $35 an ounce, and most of the countries throughout the world would define their currencies in terms of dollars. They attempt to have some kind of relationship to the dollar. And the idea was to attempt to make the world monetary system appear as though it's still closely tied to gold in some important way. And to maintain that belief, while American citizens couldn't legally own gold, there were places around the world where you could, such as people in Hong Kong, I think even in Canada, I'm sure various other countries, Switzerland certainly. And so there was a global demand for gold, and as the United States government was creating dollars more rapidly than the supply of gold was increasing, at some point it would become necessary for the dollar price of gold to rise. So just think, here we are, we're creating dollars, the additional dollars are starting to raise wages, they're raising the price of copper, lead, and zinc, raising the price of wheat, soybeans, orange juice, plywood, one thing after another, real estate. But here's gold, it's always saying it's $35 an ounce. Well, what do you think that does to the quantity of gold demanded simply for industrial purposes? It has to get greater. It's the substitution effect, as it were. Gold is unchanged. Everything it could be substituted for is rising. So the industrial demand for gold would have to be increasing. And after some years, people began to realize that sooner or later there would inevitably have to be a rise in the price of gold. And as they began to realize this, there came to be speculative runs on gold. And the government, I should have mentioned perhaps a moment earlier, starting in 1951, the London gold market reopened. It had been a market before World War II. It was closed during World War II, and in the immediate post-war years, it reopened in 1951. And the United States government, in conjunction with the Bank of England, wanted to maintain a $35 price of gold on the London gold market. Now, most of the world's demand for gold would come into the London gold market the newly mined and scrap gold would be offered for sale in the London gold market. And what do you think would happen if, at the $35 an ounce price, the quantity demanded exceeded the supply offered? If we did nothing, the price of gold would rise above $35. That would create thoughts, well, the dollar isn't that firmly tied to gold, it's not as good as gold. If you want to promote the conviction the dollar is as good as gold, then you have to keep the price at $35. Well, what has to be done so that when the quantity demanded exceeds the supply available, the price will nevertheless stay at $35? Pardon me? Yeah, the U.S. government would feed additional gold from its reserves into the London gold market, sufficient to keep the price of gold at $35. Now, this went on from 1951 to 1965, and as time went on, there came to be more powerful speculative runs, so the gold stock of the United States government from year to year was significantly declining. And finally, by 1964 or 5, it was recognized we couldn't keep this up much longer. And I should point out, in these years, from 35 to 65, there were still gold reserve requirements. The Federal Reserve was obligated itself to have a gold reserve of between 25 and 35% of its notes and checking deposit liabilities. 25% against the one and 35% against the other. I forget which, either the currency or the checking deposits. Now, as the gold stock declined, the Federal Reserve's own required gold reserve was getting dangerously close to the reserves they actually had. So the reserves they actually had, I should say, were declining to the point where there was very little more than what they were legally required to have. So it wouldn't have been very long before the Federal Reserve would be confronted with a reserve deficiency. So what do you think was done to avoid that? Pardon me? Yeah, the reserve requirements were abolished in 1965. So since then, the Federal Reserve does not have any gold reserve. And at the time, there were some commentators who were happy and saying, well, this frees up all this gold to maintain the $35 an ounce price. We can now dump all this in the London gold market. Well, 3 more years went by. They finally gave it up, closed the so-called gold window, and then they were threatening to dump the remaining reserves, to destroy the gold market. That made the market hesitate. But then it became clear this would not be done. And starting from around 1970, the price of gold began to shoot up. It reached a high of $850 an ounce in January of 1980. Then the government finally went way back on its rate of increase in the quantity of money, and the price of gold sharply declined. Now there are some renewed fears the price of gold is back from a low of maybe $260 or so. Now it's been in the neighborhood of $400. Okay, I'm going to ask you to postpone the questions till after our return. We've already run a few minutes late, so let's wait till 10 after 8, okay? Okay, now I think in answering many of these questions, I may have jumped to quite a few points without adequately covering the necessary ground in between. And so I would like to back up a bit and try to fill in the gaps. We started with the tremendous importance of money in making possible a modern economic system dependent on the division of labor. There's an important related aspect of that, that when we have money and money prices for virtually everything, we can have economic calculations and comparisons. This is point 2 under A. We compare the value of the output with the sum of the prices of the means of producing the output, and we know whether we're operating at a profit or a loss. That's a key consideration. It tells us, should we be doing what we're doing or stop? The existence of money and money prices permits economic calculations for using different methods of production. We know which is the lower cost method on the basis of the different prices of following the different methods. We can compare the profitability of different products, the profitability of investing in different industries, compare one occupation with another. And on the basis of that information, we know what to do. Other things being equal, we always want to do what will enable us to earn more and pay less. And that's an objective procedure in a monetary economy, because to the extent we succeed in doing that, we have greater monetary means. We can obtain more wealth in exchange. Now, later after the midterm, we'll spend time on the relationship between money making and the concept of productive activity. That's another very important issue. But what I want to do now is fill in the gaps in connection with the relationship between the quantity of money and the volume of spending in the economic system. And this comes under the heading, the quantity theory of money. The gist of the quantity theory of money is that the amount of money spent in the economic system depends primarily on the amount of money that exists. The quantity of money being spent in the economy depends primarily on the amount of money that exists. Now, there are different measures of the amount of money being spent. The most popular is GDP, gross domestic product. That's currently running, I think, at an annual rate of $11.7 trillion or something like that. Why is it $11.7 trillion now? Not all that many years ago, it was $5 trillion. Not all that many years before that, it was $1 trillion. What keeps this number rising year after year, pretty much? Well, the basic explanation is that the quantity of money is increasing. The larger the quantity of money, the greater is the volume of spending. And I have here two formulas connected with this. The formulas of M times V equals V. M represents the quantity of money. V is the velocity of circulation of money. That simply means the number of times in a year the average unit of the money supply is spent. The number of times in a year the average unit of the money supply is spent. That's velocity. And D is the amount of spending, demand in the sense of the amount of spending. So the quantity of money times the velocity of circulation equals aggregate demand, understood as the aggregate amount of spending. And as I say, GDP is the most popular measure, though by no means not the only measure of aggregate demand. And we can put some meat on this formula. Here's our formula. M times V equals D. M is the money supply in trillions of dollars. V is velocity. D is demand, which for the time being you can understand as GDP in trillions of dollars. And here we are, as of the present, we have a money supply of approximately 2.7 trillion. Where did I get the 2.7 trillion? Well, that would take us back to what we started looking at, M1 plus sweeps, plus yet a further component, which hopefully we'll say a little bit about. And this money supply, the average unit of it, was spent 4.3 times in the current year, giving us a GDP of $11.7 trillion. 4.3 times 2.7 should work out to 11.7. So there's $2.7 trillion being spent on an average 4.3 times in a year in a way that counts in GDP, and that's where we get 11.7 trillion GDP. Next year, the money supply will almost certainly be somewhat larger, and the GDP will also be larger. Yes, Mr. Ritchell.
In your book, you've got a velocity, and it fluctuates pretty greatly from, around 2 up to close to 7 almost.
Right.
And it seems to coincide with kind of high points or kind of recessionary or that type of time. Does that follow here? So that next year, the velocity of money, if you see that go from 4.3 to 4.6, would that indicate that we're getting more recessionary or less recessionary?
It would indicate that we're getting more inflationary, I think. A major, not the only, but a very major determinant of velocity is the rate of increase in the quantity of money and volume of spending. The more rapidly the quantity of money and volume of spending grow, other things being equal, the higher will tend to be velocity. The less rapidly they grow, the lower will tend to be velocity, for reasons which I hope to explain systematically, but probably not till next week. Yes?
We can find that really better because also we combine those two things, the rate of velocity and quantity of money. Seems like there's two independent actions. We'll talk about the Federal Reserve considering money on a moment's notice.
Yeah.
We're also talking about the velocity being what people are spending.
No, velocity is not the amount that people are spending. Velocity is the average number of times a unit of the money supply is spent in a way that counts in the aggregate we're concerned with. So here's the quantity of money. This is what the Federal Reserve directly or indirectly controls. And here's velocity, which for reasons to be explained will tend to be the higher, the more rapid is the increase in the quantity of money, and will tend to be the lower, the less rapid. And GDP is a reflection of the two. But velocity does not have the same status as the quantity of money. Velocity isn't an independent determinant. It depends mainly, as I'll try to show, on the rate of increase and prospects of the rate of increase in the quantity of money. Yes, Mr. Wilson.
I was going to report to you that the national deficit is greater than it's ever been. However, as we look at it as a percentage of GDP, though, it's not as bad as it could be. Now, it's saying that GDP, isn't the amount of money that they see in here, and the velocity, so they can kind of, I guess, control that rate or percentage that the deficit is affected by the money, right?
Does the rate of increase in the quantity of money and GDP have an impact on the significance of the deficit? Yes, it does. You see, many people look at the deficit, and each year there's a deficit. The national debt is that much higher, and many people have been concerned that the government may be faced with bankruptcy. This was a major concern, I think, of Ross Perot when he ran for president some years ago. Now, there are some serious implications of the deficit, but the federal government going bankrupt is really not one of them, because so long as the debt is payable in dollars, they can manufacture more dollars, and as your question indicates, in raising GDP, it indirectly raises next year's tax revenues too. So the deficit is not significant from the point of view of whether or not the government will go bankrupt. It won't go bankrupt so long as the money it owes is payable in its own currency. But that doesn't mean it's not a serious problem, because what keeps happening to the buying power of the money? It keeps going down. So it's very doubtful that the government could repay a debt if it were translated into the same buying power that prevailed when the money was lent to the government. All right, let me turn to this closely related formula where we try to connect prices to the quantity of money. Here we have a formula P equals D over S, and D is the same demand we just had up here. That theme is the aggregate spending, however we count it, and the price level, the general consumer price level, which is what P represents, is equal to the demand for consumers' goods in the sense of the amount of money spent to buy them, divided by the supply of consumers' goods produced and sold. For the moment, ignore these numbers. The general consumer price level is equal to the amount of money spent to buy consumers' goods. And as a rough approximation, you can think of GDP as representing that. That essentially is the amount of money spent to buy consumers' goods. And if you divide that by the supply of consumers' goods produced and sold, you have the weighted average level of prices at which the goods are sold. Let me try to flesh this out a bit more. Down in the bookstore on the second floor, they sell these bottles of water. Now, suppose I ask you the question, calculate the average price at which such a bottle was sold in the bookstore over the last 1 week. What information would you need? Yes? The money taken in exchange for the water and the number sold. So if, for example, we knew that $100 was taken in exchange for the water, and they happen to sell 100 bottles for that $100, then we know the average price at which a bottle of water was sold was $1. And obviously, the same formula would apply to any other good. New Hondas at Ray Flatabo or wherever, new shoes at Florsheim's or wherever. It easily applies to any one good, the average price at which any one good is sold in any location for any period of time. Now, all we need is to some methods whereby we can look not only at bottles of water, but also at automobiles and houses and suits of clothes, pairs of shoes, loaves of bread. We want to conceive the total output of the economy, or the total supply of consumers' goods produced and sold. We need to conceive of that in terms of some homogeneous unit. Now, we can have wide disagreement about precisely how we should do this, but I think in one way or another, we all do it in connection with various things. I suppose I would ask you, do you think the total output of the American economy today in 2004 is much larger than it was in 1904? I think there's no doubt about it, but there are some goods probably that were produced in 1904 that we're not producing at all today. There are many other goods that we're producing today that weren't produced at all in 1904. And the goods that are in common between the two periods, for the most part, there's probably been important qualitative changes. And wherever, even putting aside the qualitative changes, the goods that are produced in both points of time have not changed in a uniform multiple. So there'd be some goods that were producing 120 times more, others that were producing 3 times more, and everything in between. Nevertheless, we're able to say that we certainly are producing substantially more today than then. We would also, I think, have no doubt about saying the United States produces very substantially more than Canada, even though there are some things they produce there that we may not produce at all, and vice versa. And we certainly don't produce a uniform multiple of each thing that is produced in the two countries. Yet, one way or another, we're capable of saying that we produce more. Well, all we're attempting to do here is try to think of it in some terms of some definite amount. Whatever that definite amount might actually be, it has to be something by some standard. And if it is something of some definite magnitude, if we can say the supply of consumers' goods produced and sold in total there's such and so much in one year, and in the next year it's more or less. Well, we can conceive of the prices at which the goods are sold as formed by the ratio of how much is spent to how much is received in exchange. So, however we quantify the output, suppose I were to tell you that, and we would agree that the output of the American economy today, suppose we took it as 10 times the output of 1904. I'm sure you could argue that it's a lot more than 10 times, but let's say it were 10 times. What would be mathematically necessary to explain how it could be that over the same interval of time, the average of prices has also increased by a factor of 10? Well, what would be implied about the amount of spending? How much would you have to spend to buy 10 times the output, and yet you have to pay 10 times the price for the average unit of the output? How much? Well, we're buying 10 times more, but at 10 times the prices. Well, here we are. Suppose you try to put numbers in here. So I'm telling you, the general consumer price level is up by a factor of 10. And if we say, we agree, the supply of consumers' goods produced and sold is also up by a factor of 10. What would have to explain how 10 times the volume of goods would have 10 times the average price? What would have had to happen to the demand? It would have to be 100 times more. See, if you have 100 times as much spent to buy 10 times as much, well, what's 100 divided by 10? 10. So it takes 100 times the spending for 10 times the goods to make the prices 10 times higher. Now, suppose the volume of spending had not increased by a factor of 100. Suppose the volume of spending had increased by a factor of 12. And the quantity of goods produced and sold had increased by a factor of 10. Pardon me? Well, that would be a question. What would be in the numerator? What would we multiply demand for consumers' goods by? 12. We'd multiply by 12. And we'd multiply here. Let's do it. And this would be times 10. Well, putting in the x throws the program off, but what is 12 divided by 10? 1.2. So prices, instead of being 10 times as high, would only be 20% as high. What if, over the same interval of time, while the production and supply of goods had gone up by a factor of 10, the volume of spending had gone up by a factor of only 5. Here, if this is up by a factor of 5, what would be implied about the price level? What if I told you at some future time $500 is spent in a week to buy 1,000 bottles of water in the bookstore? What's implied about the average price? It's gone down by half. So what's happening for the price level is the outcome of the relationship between the volume of spending in the economy and the quantity of goods produced and sold. Now we know that practically every year the quantity of goods produced and sold is going up, and at the same time the volume of the price level is going up. So what explains the rise in prices? The increase in the volume of spending, the rise in aggregate demand. Prices have been rising in the United States because the volume of spending has been growing at a faster rate than the volume of production and quantity sold. Every year there's some increase, almost every year, there's some increase in the production and supply of goods, but in almost every year there is a significantly greater increase in the quantity of money and volume of spending. Can you agree that, does anyone have a problem with seeing why the rise in the price level reflects the increase in money and spending outstripping the increase in production and supply? Do you think it would be conceivable if the volume of spending did not outstrip the increase in production and supply, would the price level possibly rise? Pardon me? Well, what would be needed for the price level to go down? Well, we had an example of the price level declining just with the bottles of water. If the volume of production increased more than the volume of spending, then prices would go down. As a matter of fact, it may be surprising to learn that exactly that is what happened in the 19th century. The 19th century was a period of a tremendous increase in production. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were no railroads, no steamships, no telegraphs, hardly any steam engines. They were little more than experimental. So production was really pretty small. Population was a fraction at the beginning of the 19th century compared to what it was at the end. Like in the United States, the population was about 5 million in 1800, and it was close to 100 million in 1900. In Britain, I think the population was about 8 million in 1800 and was over 40 million in 1900. And this was the century in which the railroads were built, the steel industry was developed, ocean-going steel ships were constructed, the telephone and telegraph were introduced, electricity got started, major manufacturing began. So there was a huge increase in production, and at the end of the century, it was estimated the prices on an average were on the order of half of what they had been at the beginning of the century.